to my channel. Today I want to talk to you about preamps. Not about the preamp itself, but I'm asking the question, do you need one? I get surprisingly a lot of mail asking that very question, and people will say, I've got so and such an amplifier, why do I need a preamp? Because I can feed my input straight in and it works fine. So I'm going to go over today why or why not, because you may not need a preamp. Hopefully after you finish watching this video, assuming you watch it all the way to the end of course, some people don't. I know I was shocked. Anyway, that's enough silliness for one video. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of history. Now, it's not the boring stuff that you used to get at school. This is why preamps and amplifiers were separate. I'm going to use the company Quad, or Acoustical Manufacturing Company, if you like, based in Huntingdon, the UK, which I had the pleasure of working with. And I want to talk about one of their early amplifiers. It's called the Quad 2, which was basically a 15 watt Class A amplifier. It was probably, dare I say, one of the better of the amplifiers for the home hi-fi market. This may not necessarily be true if you're not in or from the UK, where in those days the only real hi-fi that was sold was British. If you're from America or Canada or similar places, Macintosh, and there's a whole group of amplifiers, but they all share the same basic idea. Bearing in mind that when hi-fi was sort of first started, if you like, it was mono. So you had a preamp and a mono power amplifier. Later in time, stereo came around and the preamps were changed to stereo, which were basically two mono preamps in one box, which is still basically true today. But you didn't have, in those early days, a stereo power amplifier. I mean, there were a few. Obviously I can't refer to every single product, but the first way they got round that was to sell you a second, in this case Quad 2 amplifier. Had the preamp with two sets of cables coming out, one to each of the mono amplifiers, and that's how it worked for many years. So where do we get the idea of a preamp and an amplifier separately? It's actually quite simple really, although it could be lost on today's current generation that won't know what I'm about to tell you. Obviously there was no such thing as solid state amplifiers in those days, 50s and 60s. 60s solid state was just about coming out, but most of the early solid state amplifiers were pretty awful, and that's why I think they got the reputation for that transistor sound, because they all, or predominantly, operated in Class B and had crossover distortion you could see half a mile away. So they were pretty dreadful, to be fair. And in those days you could categorically say, if you wanted hi-fi, you had a valve system, and as indeed I did. The system I'm talking about, the Quad, that was my first purchased amplifier. So you got yourself, let's say, a pair. We'll go up to stereo. They were inherently a very simple product. They had a rectifier, usually a valve, typically a GZ32 or something along those lines, and the output valves were typically KT66 in push-pull class A. And when I say class A, they really drew some current. Then it had two other valves in it, both an EF86, which was a pentode and a very low noise and high gain pentode, a valve made specially for audio. And it had two of them. The first one was basically just gain. It just amplified the signal from your preamp. And the second one was operated as a phase splitter for the push-pull output. And that was it. But because it only had those few valves, the second EF86 didn't really offer any gain. All it was a phase splitter. So all the amplification, voltage-wise, came from one EF86. And needless to say, the actual amplifier wasn't very sensitive. Preamp today really only needs one input level, and that is somewhere round about the 150 millivolts, which is typically the output from a DAC, Bluetooth or something like that. And that's without a preamp. So clearly, if you were feeding those items today into that power amplifier, you'd never drive it. You'd never get more than a couple of watts of power out of it. And that's purely because the two are basically incompatible. So in that case, you would need a preamp. Let's jump back in time again and look at what you had to contend with in the 50s and 60s and to a degree the 70s. First of all, you almost certainly had a radio tuner, which again would be in a separate box and would typically give out somewhere around about 150 to 200 millivolts. So that would be one input that you'd need on your preamp. The second input you'd need, in fact you might well need two tuner inputs, because the AM and FM receivers in those days were separate. Anyway, so you'd need two inputs there, both of roughly 150, 200 millivolts. And chances are you'd also have a reel-to-reel tape machine. And the output on that would be quite wide, because some of them had a preset output, and it could have been anything from about 200 to 500 millivolts. And often it had a variable output, maybe up to a volt. So it didn't really matter too much, because you did have an output on it which you could set to suit your preamp. So that's the third input that you need. Am I holding up three? Yes, I am holding up three fingers. The other thing that you'd forget about cassettes, because they didn't exist in those days, but equally, if you had one, if it had been invented, you'd need an input for that as well, which would have been very similar. Now the other thing you'd need, which was something that almost everybody had, would be a turntable. In those days, unlike today, where they tend to include a preamp, particularly at the lower end of the market. But if you're in the sort of upper generation of cartridges and turntables, you wouldn't buy one with an equalization preamp in it, because they tend to be a bit crappy, to be honest, because they're built to a price. Anyway, so you've just bought yourself, typically in those days you probably had a Garrard 301 and an SME arm. You could have had one of Millions, but that's a fairly popular one in its day. You could actually have had a crystal or ceramic cartridge. That was what most of them were, and needless to say, they were actually better quality, or you could buy better quality than you can today. The only ceramic cartridges or crystal cartridges you get these days tend to be on really crappy turntables, you know, the really nasty plastic ones. You know the sort I mean. And there you would have had a really nasty cartridge today and even then. But in those days, the nasty cartridges would have given out typically 2 volts, but they were designed to be fed into a fairly nasty valve record player with mainly 2 valves. So excluding that, because you wouldn't want to put that in your hi-fi system. But you would need a high impedance for that of about 1.5 to 2 megohms. I don't want to go into great detail as to why, but it's basically so it works with giving it an RIAA characteristic without EQ. That's largely what a ceramic cartridge will do if you feed it into 2 megohms. You don't need RIAA correction. Look it up, it's true. If you were in the higher category, moving coil cartridges were just virtually unavailable. And if you had one of those, you would tend to use a transformer, believe it or not, and those had a microscopic output. But most people would have had a moving magnet, and they would typically give out about 4 millivolts. And they would need RIAA equalization. So that's another input. So you need not only a very high sensitivity of 4 millivolts, you'd also need the RIAA equalization. Dare I say, if you went back even further in time to the early 50s, you would have had mono 78 RPM records to deal with, and up until 1954 all of these had different equalizations. Can you believe it? There was no standard. You could argue that they sounded similar enough that you could get away with it, but the early preamps, the early mono preamps that Quad made, had various push buttons on it, and you looked up on a little card, Columbia, RCA, they all had a slightly different EQ curve. So not only, and in those days there wasn't even a set RIAA, that tended to come in much later. So you can imagine playing a 78 was quite a mammoth task. You had to obviously put it on the turntable, say, yeah, this is a Columbia, press the first 2 buttons to get the right EQ. So clearly the preamp had to have all this stuff on it, which today doesn't exist. If I show you this circuit of the Quad, you will see also it has very extensive filters. Again, for 2 reasons. Your main source of music would have been a turntable, and in the early days 78s, and in the latter days from the sort of middle 50s, you had LPs, which were a considerable step up. Because you had all these 78s, and I think everybody knows, they don't have a very low surface noise. They're known for their sort of scratches and hiss. So it was desirable to reduce the frequency response, because early 78 didn't have any HF. I mean, you're lucky if you got 6 or 7 kilohertz out of it. So having a hi-fi amplifier, if you like, could make it sound worse, because you're amplifying all the crap from 7-ish K upwards, and it's all coming through your loudspeakers. So it's desirable. Let's say you had some LPs which were particularly good, and so you would need minimal, if any, high frequency filters because these were hi-fi amplifiers, even by today's standards. They would go down to 20-ish hertz and up to 20 kilohertz, which even today would be regarded as pretty good. It wasn't very good if you had scratchy, noisy records. So you had extra controls on the preamp. One of them was the turnover frequency that you could click. So you'd have flat, which was 20 to 20k if you like, and then you'd have one at, I think it was about 14k, one at 9k, and one at about 5k. And that was the turnover frequency that would limit the HF. And then you had another control on it, which was the amount of attenuation it had at those frequencies. So imagine you've got your really dreadful 78. You're playing that, so you select 5 or 7 kilohertz, and then with, I suppose you'd call it a volume control or second gain control, and then you'd alter that so you could either have a slow roll off like that, or with the potentiometer all the way turned round, it will go like that, and a very steep curve indeed. And it was controlled with an inductor, so you can imagine the Q on it was pretty steep, what's the word I'm looking for? Steep's the word I'm looking for. That's generally the radio or the tuner inputs. You wouldn't use the filters, particularly FM. But don't forget, we do have an AM tuner, which again would roll off naturally, depending on your country, at somewhere between 7 and 9k. If you had a little bit of a squeak or a whistle or just hiss or noise in general from your signal, you could select the usually about 9k and just a little roll off, just enough so it took away the annoyance and left all the program. That's what you needed for your basic preamp. Oh, and the other thing you'd use it for, of course, was from your tape machine, because that was pre-Dolby, and the slower the tape ran, say typically you'd use something, well, if you had quality equipment, you'd run it at 15 inches per second, and that will give you the widest frequency response, lowest distortion, and best signal to noise ratio. If you were recording speech or something like that, you could probably be using 1 7/8, which had no fidelity, again rolled off at round about 6 or 7k on a good day, and lots of hiss, so your filters would come in handy. So that's really why you had a preamp, and a very busy preamp at that. But as time went on, you needed less and less, and as quads, new models came along, they stopped the multi-channel, or I should say they stopped the multi-choice EQ, because people didn't play 78s anymore, and the ones that were the Johnny Rays and the Frankie Lanes were coming out after 1954, when the quality of the discs were produced were much better, so you could drop a lot of the filters. Sorry that was so long-winded when I haven't really answered your question yet, but I'll be right back with the answer. An increasing kind of amplifier these days is the Class D, and the higher priced, higher quality ones tend to be a power amplifier only, and you do need a preamp to drive it because it's not very sensitive. But it's becoming increasingly common, particularly in the lower end price range, to include a preamp and possibly tone controls into the Class D amplifier, because it's all controlled with a 5532 or something very similar. So the cost of adding a simple preamp to such an amplifier is pennies, and that's what they do. They rely on the fact that you're going to feed into it a DAC or a Bluetooth, almost pretty well guaranteed, and generally they are sensitive enough at about 200 millivolts ish that you can feed those items straight into the amplifier and it's fine. And you often have the added bonus, depending on whether you regard tone controls as a bonus, but if you do, they're included in the price, and it's all in the same box. If you're one of those people, or those people that have such a product, the truthful answer is you probably don't need a preamp. It would actually, or could be, detrimental if you had one, because as the amplifier is so sensitive, relatively speaking, if you then amplify the product, your input, with a preamp, you're amplifying hiss as well. So you could find that the volume control, instead of having to turn it to about 12 or 1 o'clock for a sensible listening level, it's now too loud at 9 o'clock. And that's got nothing to do with the time of the day, by the way. If you used a preamp on that, you haven't gained anything, dare I say, but gain, but you don't want any more gain. Depending on the amplifier, you won't need a preamp, and it could be detrimental if you put one on. But if you're playing records, vinyl if you prefer, you will need a preamp, and to the best of my knowledge, I've not seen a Class D with turntable inputs. These are the sort of amplifiers you're talking about, $70 to $150 for a 50 watt, or 300 watt, which is really 50 watt kind of Class D. So you're in the do-it-yourself market and you've just bought yourself a power amplifier. It's got no volume control. Clearly this needs a preamp. It needs one for a number of reasons. There are hundreds of different power amplifiers on the market. All vary from sensitivity and whatever, but most of them don't work well with a volume control on the input. It's to, again, I've covered this in previous videos, but it's to do with impedance and to a degree sensitivity. You can find, if you put a pot on the input, as you adjust the volume, you'll find the high frequency response begins to drop off. And it's just to do with impedance and the input circuitry of a power amplifier. Again, I've covered this in previous videos, so I don't want to go into it again. So an amplifier like that clearly needs a preamp, mainly to offer a low impedance output, which this will like as an input, and the input has a high impedance, which will suit most of the things you're likely to plug into it. I can't tell you how much gain or amplification you will need, because I have no idea what you're plugging into it. I don't have any idea of the power amplifier sensitivity. That's why when I've reviewed various preamps in the past, I've given you options to say, if you want a gain of 10, change this resistor, and by and large most preamps you can alter the gain. Always with a preamp, you never want more gain than you actually need. Your volume control on average should be at about 10 o'clock for average listening levels. If you've got to turn it to about 3 o'clock, or you can't drive your amplifier into distortion, I know it sounds daft to say, well, I don't really want to drive it into distortion. Well, that's true, but you should be able to, how can I put this? You should be able to drive, there should be enough gain in the preamp and amplifier for you to be able to drive certain pieces of music into clipping. And the reason for that is, if you have an input source that's very low, or you're playing a piece of music that's very low, and you can't do that, when you turn the volume up, you may not be able to get enough volume out of it to hear it. So you always want, let's say, just random figures. Let's say your amplifier needs 1 volt. You want a preamp that would give 1.5 volts. And it's not because you want to drive the amplifier into distortion, but if you have a low, say a piece of music where it's recorded very quietly, but you want it louder, you need that extra gain to be able to drive the amplifier harder. Because if your 1 volt that comes out of your preamp and your 1 volt in the amplifier, that's fine. It means that you'd have to have the volume on full to get maximum power from that amplifier. But imagine if the music you're playing is averaging 500 millivolts. You won't get it loud enough to listen to. So that's an occasion. I hope that's not confusing. It sounds confusing to me. And I know it. Hope that makes sense. Something, of course, that I haven't gone into, that is a preamplifier with tone controls. I can't tell you whether you should have one or not. For me personally, I believe that a preamp should add nothing but that necessary gain. If you want extra bass, or you want less treble, or more everything and have that shape, you will have to use tone controls. They do introduce colour, distortion, particularly when they're in the lift part of because there is less feedback in the preamp and you're getting more gain out of it. Be prepared for a more coloured sound, even when the tone controls are in the vertical position, because all the peripheral circuitry is still there. It does introduce colour. But if you like the sound of it, I'm not going to say don't do it because you're wrong, because if that's what you like, then that's the answer. I'm just giving myself as an example. It goes by the old saying, crap in, crap out, but louder. I mean, that's the definition of a good preamp. But it also means the highest quality in, the highest quality out. Largely unchanged. A preamp shouldn't change the sound. If it does, it's not a preamp, it's a filter. I'm not saying you shouldn't have that, but I'm just saying a preamp should only offer gain, nothing else. A preamp by itself cannot make your amplifier sound better, because you can't get out better than you put in. Saying that, if it presents your input circuitry with the right impedances, i.e. highish impedance input and low impedance output, it means your amplifier will be presented with exactly what it's looking for, a low impedance input. This could be accomplished by certain DACs that do have this built in, but if they don't, the preamp can make your amplifier appear, well no, it doesn't appear, it does sound better, but it hasn't done it because of something magical it's inserted. It's done it because it's presented the right impedances, largely. Anyway, I hope this hasn't been too confusing or too boring, but once again, thank you so much for watching. It's 110% appreciated, probably even more. Bye bye for now.